Question number 6, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Does she stand by her statement that funding for at-risk students announced in Budget 2016, quote, is a clear example of how our funding system could be changed to get more support to those students who need it most, end quote? If so, is she concerned that a recent survey found over a third of principals are considering reducing support staff hours in 2017?
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.
Tēnā koe. The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr. Speaker, I stand by my statement. In regard to the second part of the question, I'm more concerned that the member either doesn't know or misunderstands that the survey had a response from just 307 out of approximately 2,380 principals, which is 7.8%, not a third. Of those 119, 10 from the PPTA and 109 from the NZAI that said they were considering changing their staff support hours. Mr. Speaker, I'd be concerned if principals weren't considering what staffing they required for the next year. I think that's highly appropriate. I also think it's highly misleading to use a teacher trade union survey to conclude that all our schooling sector is making a change based on the views of just 5%.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
What does she say to the Wellington principal from a Decile 1 school, quote, as a Decile 1 community, there is no option of raising the money through parent donations and fundraising. Therefore, we can only reduce our expenditure as much as possible, which then disadvantages our students further.
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr. Speaker, I would say that if he needs assistance in thinking about how his budget or her budget is to be used, the Ministry of Education is available to do that. Under this government, funding for primary schooling has gone up over 30%, for secondary school over 24%. In terms of operational grants, next year there will be a distribution of $1.35 billion. On top of that, that school, being Decile 1, will receive a proportion of the targeted $12.3 million that we will be making available next year.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
How can she be sure that that new funding for at-risk students will actually target those most in need, given a briefing to her on the 16th of August identified that 20,000 students identified as at-risk were, quote, missing, end quote? How can she target funding to their needs if she doesn't know where they are?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr. Speaker, because I rely on the anonymised data that we're now using to identify which young people come from homes where they have been on long-term benefit dependence. And how can I trust that that funding will get to them? Well, I trust the very principals that you are arguing are incapable of running their schools.
True question, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
How will $2.30 per week for each at-risk student help improve the wellbeing and achievement of those students when the government won't tell schools which students they are, and 20,000 of them, by her own admission, have already gone missing?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr. Speaker, irony upon irony. We are not going to stigmatise these particular children in the same way as decile funding. No, perhaps the member doesn't understand what anonymised means. We won't be naming the children. What I do trust is that principals do know who the kids at their school are that are at risk, do know who the kids are at their school that are most challenged. So it has been traditional that the government provides funding to schools. Operational grants, by the way, is a bulk fund that goes to schools, and they use their discretion as to how they will cause learning to happen for every child there, and that's what I expect to occur.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
I seek leave to table the advice given to Heke Parata dated the 18th of August, in which she wrote in her handwriting she would like to see how she can track the missing students.
Order, don't need that part. I need the source of order.
Sorry, it's the Ministry of Education.
So it's sought under the Official Information
The Official Information Act, and it is the Minister's handwriting.
That part's not important. Leave us sought to table information from the Ministry of Education sourced under the Official Information. Is there any objection? There is no objection to being tabled.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Did she receive other advice in April that alternative education providers have up to 60% of students at risk, but would not necessarily receive any additional funding under the new at-risk model? If so, how will she ensure that the funding actually reaches those students?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, I'll have to rely on the member that is my April paper. I'm pretty sure that it's the case. I'm well advised. I'm happy for the member to have that. The point about the targeted funding is that it is to the schools to use for the students. It is not a voucher. It isn't to the specific child. It is to the provider institution. Alternative education providers, therefore, are have a relationship to their provider school. The funding will go to their provider school, and their provider school will work out with the alternate ed provider how to support the students they have.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
So is she saying that alternative education providers who deal with at-risk students from a number of different schools are not guaranteed that they will receive any of the additional funding that those schools will be receiving for the supposedly at-risk students?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, I'm not saying that because, again, I must reiterate my trust in the principals who are in charge of these schools. The very principals the member sought in his primary question to assert were capable people. I am saying they are. I trust them to do that.
First answer.
It's not true. I corrected you on the...
Order. Question number 7.